Oh, my biceps, it's cramping. Just kidding.
Hey guys, so a common question I get from clients, from people I barely know, from people I know closely, is why do I get these freaking muscle cramps? We actually experienced that lovely phenomenon this weekend. My lovely husband had a great giant calf cramp, and I actually had another person approach me and said that they had a calf cramp at a karate seminar that we were at. So lots of different reasons why. So I tried to look into it a little bit, and I found, ta-da, one good study. So this is Predictors of Calf Cramping in Rugby League. And it's from 2014, and they were primarily looking at rugby players. So they're pretty much looking for different factors, looking at a host of different factors to try to figure out why calf cramps occur in these athletes. They said that rugby is a collision sport, and it has frequent periods of high intensity activity interspersed with short periods of low intensity activity. So it's not the same as like a marathon run or an endurance sport. And they did make a couple references to some previous studies that had been done in endurance sports, how there will be like cramps that are occurring in like long distance runners. So some interesting stuff. They talked about some background information with those calf cramps that are occurring in endurance sport people. There's actually 2 studies that were done on them, and they were not related to hydration. So I know a lot of times people are like, oh, eat a banana, you need potassium. That actually wasn't even mentioned. Electrolyte balance wasn't even mentioned, but hydration was, which I mean, that plays hand in hand, but still. So that's actually being considered less and less part of the reason why. I know when I was in college, we actually mentioned it might be more sodium just because you're sweating out more, but I digress. So they called this exercise-associated muscle cramps. They actually said that there's 3 different types of muscle cramps. There's this type, exercise-associated muscle cramps, but then there's also occasional cramps and nocturnal cramps, which I didn't get into in this study, but that has to do with like not using a muscle, and then all of a sudden it like cramps up, like your body's trying to use it or something. And then there's also the nighttime cramps, and those are actually of a different cause. So they're actually different altogether, which is good to know because that gets kind of confusing. So what they decided to do was they tested these guys. They not tested them, they actually recorded a bunch of information. So they wanted to know their competition level, their age, ethnicity, playing position, history of cramping, pre-cramping, low back pain that resulted in time out of gameplay, orthotic usage, foot posture, foot strike, muscle flexibility, calf girth, hydration status, and number of games played. That was a lot of information, and they did acknowledge that that's a ton of stuff to try to get into. But they were trying to look for as many associated factors as they could. So they kind of divided people into calf cramp group and non-calf cramp group. So if you had ever had a calf cramp, you were in one group. If you were not and never had a calf cramp, you were in the other group. And they tried to look and see if there was any associated factors between all those things that I just listed. So they went through and found out all the information that they needed regarding all those different factors. And they noticed a couple of different things, and they kind of go over it. This is actually a super long study. Let's see. What they ended up finding was, I'm going to pull up the thing here. So big things is some valid predictors. What they felt of calf cramping was your age and competition level, so how many competitions you had actually gone through, the number of games that you had played, and then having a calf cramp history and more frequent cramps, which is like, okay, how do you prevent that? But they were saying that if you have more of a history of calf cramps, it's almost like you're just more susceptible to doing it again, almost like your muscles are just like on the edge, ready to cramp. So if you have had that in the past, you're more likely to have calf cramps again. Sorry about your luck. And then the last one that was a really interesting factor that had never been noted before was low back pain that actually had you pulled out of a game. And they think this could be due to like some neuromuscular stuff going on, but they didn't know the exact reason why the back pain was occurring, so they couldn't really speculate too much, but they felt like it could be that. I would think it would be altered gait patterns, but they didn't really cover any of that stuff. The invalid predictors were ethnicity, playing position, which doesn't seem right. It seems like you'd have more calf cramps in certain positions, but they didn't mention it as a valid predictor. Your flexibility had nothing to do with it. Calf girth, so the size of your calves, had nothing to do with it. And hydration, they said there was no correlation between the hydration of the players and their susceptibility to calf cramps. Calf girth is also actually an interesting one because you'd think that bigger, stronger calves wouldn't cramp as much, but my husband has giant calves. They're very defined. He had a calf cramp. I have little baby tiny skinny calves. I haven't had calf cramps. Anyway, whatever. So that's not part of it either. So it's just really interesting how the stuff that we think does one thing does not do that thing. So what they're kind of getting at, which they didn't talk about too much as far as the actual practical application, but they were essentially saying that if you reduce your training intensity, especially if you're susceptible to calf cramps, I can't even say it, calf cramps. If you reduce your training intensity, you may be less likely to develop more calf cramps. But obviously, if you're a professional athlete or if you're even a recreational athlete, at some point you are going to increase your intensity. So on the flip side, you would want to improve conditioning and range of motion. Now, they did say flexibility wasn't a big thing, but mobility and flexibility are not always synonymous. So maybe increasing your ability to use your calf through a fuller range of motion, that might be something that would prevent those cramps and not have that tightening of those muscles happen. Remember, your muscles are actually made up of muscle fibers, and they go like this. Whenever a cramp or any kind of contraction occurs, the muscle fibers are going this way. If you learn to use that calf through a full range of motion with those muscle fibers crossing and lengthening and all that kind of stuff, then you're probably less likely to have that kind of thing happen. I've actually heard in the past that calf cramps are caused by your brain trying to send signals to a muscle for it to contract, and then it doesn't, and then it ends up sending so many signals that it causes tetanus. That might actually be more related to one of these other of the 3 types of calf cramps. But anyway, hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight. I know I get lots of questions about this, and people are like, why is this happening? And we feel like we do everything right, and it doesn't help anything. Probably number one thing, especially if your calf cramps are related to activity, it's good to be hydrated, obviously. It's good to have your electrolytes, but it's probably not that. It's probably your conditioning. Just back off a little bit. Give yourself some time to strengthen those calves up. Get to where you can actually do the activity that is causing you cramps without it being too much. And if it obviously causes cramps, back off a little bit. And then maybe you will be less susceptible to having more cramps. Okay? Hopefully that helps. Bye, guys.